Hello and welcome to another session of Family and Community Focus. This is a program sponsored by the Collaborative Research Initiative, the Institute for Community Health Promotion. And I'm Kevin Miller, your host. In this episode, we're going to talk about a very timely topic that has received increased attention over the past few years in portions of New York and throughout the country, and that's disaster preparedness. While this may not be a topic of the foremost concern in those of us in Western New York, it certainly is in other parts of New York and especially around the world and other parts of the country. Today, I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to discuss the topic with Dr. Jason Rivera. He is a coordinator of the Public Administration track in the Public Administration and Nonprofit Management program at Buffalo State and teaches courses, and particularly a course in disaster and response management. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
So let me start by asking, maybe we can define a little bit or talk a little about the various types of disasters that you've studied and to get people familiar with what we're talking about.
So predominantly, in my past, I've studied natural disasters, particularly hurricanes, community resilience, so how communities respond and recover from these situations. More recently, I've been looking at Hurricane Harvey in Houston and Maria in Puerto Rico. Over the past several years, I've also looked at a number of human-induced disasters, such as the BP oil spill and what that's meant for the Gulf Coast. But those are huge disasters. Disasters happen every day around the country and around the world that are a lot smaller in scale than these big things that we see on TV. The other day, actually last week, we saw near the Finger Lakes severe flooding that affects us all the time. Flooding is probably the most predominant disaster people deal with in the United States, either due to people's choosing to live in particular areas or being forced to live in particular areas. But we also see fires as well. So you see the fires in Colorado and California, but these are large-scale events. Every year in the city of Buffalo, for example, we have residential fires that affect not only the city and its personnel, but families on a daily basis.
So you're talking again from the massive part of it to, no matter what, if it's big or small, it affects somebody, it could be disastrous to them.
Yes, obviously if your home burns down or if your home is destroyed or affected in some way, even if your car is affected in some way, it's a disaster to you, right? If you're missing your car and you have to get to work and your income is potentially limited because you're not able to get to work, that's a disaster for you and your family, yes.
And dealing with those on a pre-level for preparedness is what we're going to kind of talk a little bit about today. But also we can touch about some of the other pieces as the conversation goes. So I appreciate getting us up to speed about what we're going to be talking about here. What are types of things that we're talking about disaster preparedness that, let's go from a parent perspective now.
Okay.
What should parents think about in preparation for an emergency? What should a family be thinking about in preparation for an emergency?
So when a lot of times as parents, and I'm a parent myself, we tend to have a lot of priorities in our life that kind of make us think not about the potentiality of a disaster. And that's a normal psychosis or normal psychology that everyone has. But what we should think about on a daily basis is having some type of set-aside emergency kit available to all of us. So when something happens, an emergency, a fire, a flood, or some type of local event that may not be necessarily a disaster, but it can affect your neighborhood, that we have prepared. Particularly in Western New York, where we have to deal with snow all the time and people can get trapped in their homes or even in their cars. Having an emergency kit for you and your kids is extremely pertinent for you to get through being trapped in your house for several days. So when you're thinking about putting these kits together, you obviously want to have the essentials: bottled water, canned foods, but one of the things that people tend to forget are the therapeutic things that can get you through several hours or maybe a few days where you might go stir crazy, or even your kids going stir crazy and driving you crazy in your home. So things like stuffed animals, board games, portable video games that are battery run. These are all things that you should have on top of flashlights with the batteries, by the way, because a lot of people have things that they put aside and they forget to actually put the batteries in it.
Or the batteries have been in there for so many years that they're corroded inside
Exactly. Having emergency blankets, especially in Western New York, if you're trapped in your car or your family's trapped in your car, these are things that an emergency blanket costs $1 something. And it looks almost like a cellophane or even an aluminum sheet that you just put over yourself, and they're life-saving materials. But then also having emergency or important documents stuffed away in some type of waterproof or even fireproof container. One of the easiest things to do is to take your documents, passports, identification, medical insurance cards, things like that, and put them in a Ziploc bag and double bag it, and then put it aside. So that way, if something were to happen, it's somewhat safe or somewhat contained, because when a disaster happens, everyone is in a mind frame where you just want to get help. You just want to get help. You need help from the doctor. You need help from emergency services. But you tend to forget that you also need the documentation that goes along with that. And especially today in the political environment we're in, having identification, particularly in vulnerable minority communities, especially immigrant communities, having that identification on you and accessible at all times is pertinent to getting through one of these events.
Yeah, and you're talking about, like, you have a firebox at home.
Yes.
Put the stuff in there so it's there.
Yes.
And then, you just got to know where the key is sometimes or something like that.
Yes, knowing where all this stuff, the password,
Yeah.
Forgetting that.
And things happen so fast. You may or may not have a lot of time to adjust to it. I mean, you talk about the Colorado fires or California fires, people all of a sudden they have to be out in minutes. Or tornado, we didn't talk about tornadoes could be happening. They don't happen much in this region, but they do happen. The flooding can happen in a moment's notice where you didn't think it was going to happen, and all of a sudden something broke, a levee broke, or a dam broke, or somehow the water got to
a water main in your neighborhood and your house gets flooded.
Yeah. So the importance of speaking to, you kind of alluded to this, but your neighbors and having a decent relationship with your neighbors and how that can help.
So one of the things that research has shown and also practice has shown is that having good relationships with your neighbors, with your immediate social network, is extremely vital in any situation. We refer to this as social capital, particularly bonding social capital. This is the connections the social connections people have with their immediate social networks. That can be your family, your immediate neighbors, or even people that live in your neighborhood. And it's important because in times of emergency, you can't do it all on your own. As you had said, things happen very quickly, and you're not necessarily thinking of all the potential issues or all the potential options that you have. A lot of times, and we've spoken about this before, of neighbors helping neighbors in these situations. Sometimes if you have a neighbor that has a generator, for example, a lot of times in a lot of emergencies, your electricity goes. So lights are gone. Your refrigerator the food in your refrigerator is done. And that sometimes people have life support systems like ventilators or dialysis machines in their home that they need to run in order to survive. And having that personal connection with people in your neighborhood can potentially allow you to share resources in order to get through what's going on. And we see this throughout the world. We see this within the United States. But in the United States, we have moved to a weird type of culture where neighbors don't talk to neighbors. We can live in neighborhoods and lovely developments in the suburbs, but you may not even talk to your neighbor or know who the person is that lives next door to you. But although that may give you a sense of comfort, if something happens, you're on your own. And that's the sad part. What's interesting is those people that I've met and talked to over the years have said just having a conversation about what could potentially happen or talking about what they saw in the news, that some devastation, can bring out information sharing about what your neighbor may or may not have. And this is particularly important for families. When disasters happen, you as a parent may not even be at home, right? And so your kids may be at home or your kids may be playing with somebody in the neighborhood. So what do you do when you're stuck at work or stuck on the highway trying to get home and your kids are waiting for you and you're scared to death that something's going to happen to them. Well, talking to your neighbors and having that social network, having that bonding social capital can provide you the ability to say, hey, if something happens, would you be willing to watch my kids for a few hours? Or could you just make sure that there's a call, someone that they can call, the kids can call and go over to their home just so they're safe?
Yeah, and getting them transferred to a family or member even, or something simple like that.
Yeah.
So this is probably a self-explanatory statement here, but when's a good time to start planning?
Well, yesterday, I guess, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about in emergency management and disaster planning is that in the United States, it's typically a reactive type of situation. We typically prepare for a disaster after a disaster happens. And that's usually when we're most vulnerable and we've lost everything. However, we want to start doing it now. Something can happen today, tomorrow, whenever. And if we're not prepared for that, we're going to suffer. So one of the things we can do is you can go home today and you can start talking to your family about, hey, if something were to happen. And if you have kids, turn it into a game. Turn it into, hey, if the end of the world comes tomorrow, what should we do? There's actually some interesting programs throughout the Midwest that they're called zombie apocalypse emergency management, where they have workshops and they actually theme it around zombies taking over the world. And what do you do and how do you prepare? What should you have in your home to prepare for something where nobody can get to you? You're on your own. How do you function as a family unit? How do you survive as a family unit? Now, I don't think zombies are going to come around. I hope not. But the premise is the same. Right. If there's a fire or if there's a flood, if there's a hurricane, if there's a blizzard, what do you do? How can you prepare for these situations with potential isolation? You
know, one of the questions as you're describing this, the blizzard term just resonated with me. My wife is from Florida, so when we first moved up here, immediately we had to make sure she had a packet of stuff for the vehicle. We have a lot of immigrants or migrant folk that come from areas that do not experience the winter blizzards and all that kind of stuff, and even having the proper materials, the proper clothing and things like that, being able to grab it. So if anybody's working with that population, or if we have individuals that are getting services or something like that, it might be a way that people who are in that field might want to talk about this topic too.
Definitely. A lot of the social service organizations that are dealing with new immigrants to the area, and not only international immigrants, as you had said, people from Florida. I have friends in the south and southeast and the southwest. If it snows half an inch, they freak out, right? So people that come from other countries that are not only unfamiliar with the culture, unfamiliar with the social support mechanisms, the emergency management assistance mechanisms, on top of not understanding or not having familiarity with the weather, they need to be explained this to. And that's where educational programs come into effect. A lot of times we tend to, or social service organizations tend to put that on the back burner or not even think about it, simply because they're servicing communities that have other immediate needs. Right. However, when things happen or something comes on the news, organizations like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army do a decent job of going out and trying to educate some of these communities at the organizations that they are seeking services. But yes, talking to them, putting it into a context or a language context that they can grasp is of utmost importance, because a lot of the immigrants that come to this area are either refugees or fleeing some type of situation where there is a deep-rooted distrust or paranoia about the government. My work with Katrina and some places in New Jersey with Sandy, a lot of immigrant groups that were in need of aid were very scared to either go for help from the Red Cross or even FEMA because they were afraid of potential issues with the government, regardless of their legal status. And so knowing that they are eligible for aid, regardless of immigration status, in addition to being cognizant of, hey, it's going to snow a lot here. You might not be used to that. These are the clothes you're going to need in the winter. This is the stuff you may want to think about putting in your car and having in your home. They're all educational tools that not only immigrants need, but also regular citizens as well.
So the idea that we're going to create this plan, we're going to know our neighbors. Who else should know about this plan? How should we make sure that we can activate this plan?
So typically when you put a plan together, you want to obviously speak to everyone in your household, right? Your spouse, if you have children, your children, but also your immediate family, people that live in the vicinity, in the same town, in the same city. But you also want to notify people that live outside of your area if you have a social network outside of the area. Time after time, we see that people tend to recover faster if they have social networks that bridge outside of the geographic area you live in. For example, if something were to happen and you had to leave your home, it's much easier to say, hey, call your cousin, your mom, your dad, whoever that lives in another state or a few towns over, say, could I come sleep on your couch for the next 2 days until I get something or I can get services. So you want to notify them. You also want to be able to notify, sometimes a lot of organizations, places that you work, have their own emergency management plans, either by regulation, federal regulations or state regulations. So you knowing and expressing what where your employment organization's plan is to your spouse or your kids is also very helpful. You also want to notify, if you have children, their school. If in an event something happens, who should be the first call outside of that emergency contact list? I know all schools have an emergency contact list, but if, for example, you list the mother and father of the child on the list and you're in a disaster area, well, the school may not be able to reach them. So who outside of that network, that immediate network, could they potentially call?
Yeah, it's just, I'm just trying to think of some other aspects of it too. You're talking about calling somebody. Communication can be a problem in the middle of a disaster. And maybe having people or alert them to how you're going to try to get a communication avenue with people. So
communication is probably one of the number one things that break down in emergency situations. Not only for people, the direct victims of the disaster, but the emergency management first responders. Knowing where to go, who to service, it's one of the things that disrupt the effectiveness of responses. However, there are a number of for example, social media tools that are starting to be put in place that run from anybody's cell phone. Now, granted, if the cell phone towers go down, then it's still a problem. However, you're able to get outside the area. Facebook, for example, has a feature, an emergency event feature, where it allows family members or anyone in your social network on Facebook for you to check in and say, I'm safe, or I am here, or I saw such and such. And this has been a very effective way of decreasing mental stress among families that not only that live in disaster areas, but live outside disaster areas. There's also an interesting app called WhatsApp. It's a communication feature that doesn't necessarily run on traditional telecommunication networks, and it allows people to talk almost like an AM/FM radio. You can hear a lot of other people talking at the same time to communicate like that. It was used in Puerto Rico among the disaster victims, but then also I just had a student that worked for the Red Cross do a lot of first responder work back in November there. And she said that all the first responders had to use that because the satellites were down, the cell phone coverage was horrible. And so that's another effective way or semi-effective way to communicate. But again, reliance on technology will always lead to potential problems when it breaks down.
So that was backup plan for it.
So the backup plan is always, again, being able to communicate with others and being able to have the social network in your neighborhood.
As you were bringing, I was just thinking also too that not a natural disaster, but when we sometimes have mass shootings or something along that line, that's a disaster.
Oh yeah.
And being able to communicate through that and navigate through that, or if there's a fire inside of one of the buildings or there's a concert or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in situations where telecommunications is not disrupted, so in those types of events where people do have the ability to do up-to-date, minute-by-minute type of, I am here, or the potential shooter is here, it's an effective way of getting people out of harm's way, but then also getting first responders and emergency personnel keyed into where they should be or where they can be most effective in their response.
We're starting to run a little bit short on time. What have I not asked you that, that's probably a loaded question. We'll probably go next couple hours. But that you'd like to make sure that people are aware in this preparedness modality. Listening to, one thing we didn't talk about was getting accurate information, who to listen to, because you can get so much misinformation along the way.
So one of the things that we've learned studying communication of the availability of resources in the aftermath of disasters is that official channels, for example, TV, newspapers, even social media, can sometimes not be effective. However, it's all about the old axiom of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And having that social network is imperative, because even though you may not know it, having someone in your social network that you run into that does know will potentially save your life, save your family's life, and allow you to recover faster. We also have been looking at a number of things in relation to how people make decisions. And again, it's totally or predominantly based on your access to information about what's going on. So being able to, in a disaster situation, if you are able to go to community centers, go to even religious centers, that's where people congregate in times of emergencies, either for information, either for psychological therapy, whatever. But that's where the information is as well. A lot of times we've noticed and we've witnessed that a lot of disaster victims, even if they live in a high hazard area, they aren't familiar with what FEMA has available, what Small Business Administration has available, or even local emergency management assistance has available. So they've learned how to access that information by literally talking to either religious congregation members, people that friends they know, people that they've never met before. Just meeting other people is essential, and not being scared of what you see on TV. The dramatized freaking out in disaster situations is something that social scientists have been studying for many years, and it doesn't necessarily happen. The mass panic, the looting, don't get me wrong, there is some level of that to a certain extent in places, but the majority of the time it does not occur, and people are helping other people.
And I think the other thing is more and more we're able to see these things in advance, so we're able to get advanced warning. So listening to the emergency management system, the people that are there, there's some people that want to shelter in place, period, no matter what. You're not going to change some of them, but listening to what they're telling you, if you got evacuation zones, routes, certain things, or when things are going to happen.
Yes. One of the things, you should always listen to the emergency broadcasts, and you should always listen. If someone tells you, or the governor tells you, or the mayor tells you to evacuate, they're not doing that just because they think it's a minor thing. The reason they tell you that is to reduce your vulnerability and the vulnerability of first responders, because the first responders are putting themselves in harm's way to save you if you decide to just buckle down in your home because you didn't feel like leaving. So listening to the evacuation notices is paramount. Whenever someone ever asks me about something similar to that, I always think of a comedian who one time said on TV, it's not that the wind is blowing, it's what the wind is blowing. Because I know a lot of people, especially I have a few friends in southeastern Louisiana that they buckle down. They have hurricane parties. It's not the necessarily smartest thing to do, because although the wind may be blowing, the wind could be blowing a car, could be blowing a street sign.
Some projectile.
Yeah, projectile, and it doesn't matter how fit you are.
Right. Well, we're gonna have to end it on that note, but I think that I just wanted to make sure people understood what part of disaster preparedness is also listening to the folks that are doing it. And as you mentioned, the first responders. I add to, if you have respect for those first responders, this
Yes.
is one way of helping to show that respect, other than showing up at parades and things like that.
Yes.
So on that note, I hope you enjoyed today's show, and thank you, Dr. Rivera, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we hope you learned a little bit about disaster preparedness and what it's going to take, and hopefully you will go out there and work to create a plan that everybody knows and can implement.